Our next guest compares the current U.S. business climate to China's. He's not doing this as a joke. He's actually taking a look at this. He's got some recent issues that he cites, like a potential ban on TikTok and the controversy over the acquisition of U.S. Steel, as being driven by politics and national security concerns. I would even say not national security concerns as much as national interest rather than profits. And joining us right now to talk about this is Greg Epp. He's the Wall Street Journal's chief economics commentator and deputy economics editor. You're taking a big picture look. You mentioned a few things that have happened, including the $8.5 billion that we just gave to Intel. You mentioned a few things, but I think, Greg, your bigger point is that companies and boardrooms have to think more and more about politics before they make any decisions.
Right. Well, isn't that the natural consequence of our embrace of intervention, right? I mean, whether it's tariffs, whether it's industrial policy, subsidies for electric cars or whatever, or all the national security stuff related to China. Increasingly important business decisions have a political element, which means that if you're in the boardroom of one of these companies, whether it's TikTok or U.S. Steel or Intel or whatever, you've got to evaluate the political environment in everything you do. You might say, well, what else are we going to do? China essentially took the world down this path, and you just can't stand by passively while China exploits our openness. What you worry about is that in trying to meet national interest, politicians increasingly define it as their interest. And that's kind of what bothered me, Becky, about last week, is that it looks like how Republicans decide to vote on TikTok might actually have more to do with how Donald Trump feels about Facebook than it does about the national security risk. Same with U.S. Steel. Is it good for Biden's prospects in Pennsylvania? That seems to be the deciding factor.
How about the abstention yesterday, too, Greg? I mean, how we feel about Israel is how the left flank for President Biden feels about him on re-election. I mean, we throw Israel under the bus just to get a few more votes in November. That's pretty bad.
I mean, it's interesting. Last week, Jensen Huang, who's the CEO of NVIDIA, he was doing his, a 1-hour press conference. He was asked about, well, you have a lot of operations in Israel and so on. And I thought he dealt with it, reasonably well. He said, we have a lot of folks in the West Bank. We're going to keep them there. We're going to take care of them. We have a lot of folks in Israel. They're very important to our current product set. But those are the kinds of questions and issues CEOs increasingly have to deal with. And you step wrong and you're going to pay the price. Disney's a very good example, right? Got on the wrong side of Ron DeSantis, and DeSantis tried to make it as painful as possible for Disney.
I mean, it's a really interesting shift. It's been happening for years, I guess. What do you think the answer is? Because I think you're right to point out that national interest can be twisted to whatever the person in charge sees as their own interest. I mean, national security is an issue that I think we should be putting before profits. National interest, especially when, that is determined by whoever's in charge, that's a very different issue.
I think it would be helpful to have essentially the guidelines about what's driving our decisions be as transparent as possible. For a while, we had the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States screening foreign investment, and it was a relatively compact group, and it didn't look at everything. But in the last year, we've vastly expanded the remit of that group to sort of look at quite a few more things. And frankly, when you have, ongoing antitrust reviews like subsidy decisions, it just hands the political people more and more sort of pressure points. I think the burden really, though, is on the companies to do the right thing by their shareholders and their products. You look at a company like Boeing, which used to make great commercial airliners, but increasingly sort of seems to have lost its way. And it's hard not to escape the conclusion that part of that might be related to how they focused on cultivating their biggest customer, the Pentagon, by doing things like moving their head office to Arlington, Virginia. It may be that I think the real burden really here, Becky, is on the folks running the companies to stay focused on making great products rather than trying to please whoever's in the White House at that particular moment.
Greg, you did mention just industrial policy, and some of it is security related. I guess we need to onshore all these important industries. We don't want to be left out in the cold, but some of it's not. Some of it is just, you mentioned EV subsidies. I guess you could connect the dots to national security way down the road, but a lot of it is just the government deciding which way the economy should go, who the winners and who the losers should be at. It has nothing to do with national security. We're just drifting that way. The IRA.
Well, yeah, and honestly, the argument for industrial policy is that you have market failures when things like national security come along. But you sometimes get the impression that at least this administration defines market failure so broadly that virtually anything could fit under that definition. Failure to pay good wages, that's a market failure. Absence of on-site childcare, market failure. You keep going and going, and suddenly that becomes a reason to pile on all sorts of other parameters when you're dealing with business. You look at the EV stuff, you look at the CHIPS Act on semiconductors, you can see that there are a lot of progressive priorities. You can have a positive or a negative opinion about those priorities, but they definitely get in the way of trying to meet the central goal of those programs, which is to build up indigenous capacity in those areas. And if you're a company thinking of doing business with Uncle Sam on these terms, you have to evaluate, well, how much do we want to get on board with these terms? Is it really ultimately in our customers and shareholders' best interest?
Faustian bargains, yeah.